Hi guys, and welcome to part 2 of this practical session, which is the first practical session we are having, and it's to build a basic Spring Boot API, REST API. So for the first session, we had to initialize the Spring application, and then we opened it in our favorite ID. We started it and saw some errors, fixed those errors. We added dependencies for the database and connected the database with MySQL. If you have not yet seen it, please just refer to the last video on this series. My name is Ngane and I am a software engineer, and you're watching the series Building Secure, Scalable, Fault Tolerant, and Low Latency APIs using Java and Spring Boot. And this is the second part of the first practical, which is building a fundamental API endpoint. So let's continue from where we left off. We were on a Spring application, and then when we run it, of course, we had a successful run, as you can see, with our configuration, the properties file, and the application was running on port 8080. So right now, we are going to attempt to use an MVC approach, which is going to be a model view controller. But in this case, we are going to have 3 folders doing the building, and it's just best approach for monolith like this. This is a monolithic application for now, is to create some folders to host different sections of our application. Now, if you watch our introductory videos, I think lesson 2, I talked about how the layout and the MVC approach can relate to each other, and we also talk about that the layout for every API is designed in a layered architecture where we have the controller. We also have which is where the API endpoints are going to reside. We have the business layer, which is where the business logic is going to be, and the repository or the data layer, which is where our data access is going to happen. So we are going to create folders to represent those layers. So we are going to create a package. We're going to call it controller. We're also going to create another package. We are going to call it the service layer, right? Or you can call it the business layer, but we're going to keep it at the service layer. And we are also going to create another layer called the repository layer. Okay. Now we are going to follow the small case for the packages, and then we're going to follow the camel case for the naming of classes. Now we're also going to create one last folder called, called the model layer. And remember the MVC approach, which is the model view controller. In this case, we don't have a view, so the model and the controller is present, and it's also tied. It's also just happened to be that we have the controller in the layered application. So in essence, you have like a model view controller. Some people regard the controller as the view, right? Model view controller, where the model and the controller and the service are called like the controller layer. Then the model is the model. Then the view, there's really no view in the API section apart the view going to be like a web application or a mobile application on the other end. So it's basically the client end. But for API there is no view. So if you look about the layered architecture, we have the controller, the repository and the service layers. These are the layered architecture, and they will have some part of the MVC which also used there. Now the model is where we are going to be keeping our models. Now if you don't know, Java is an object-oriented programming language, and we are going to use objects in order to represent ideas, our classes, and our databases, our database tables, and different abstractions. And if you don't know, if you're a beginning programmer, I'll advise you to go and learn a lot about object-oriented programming. This particular course is not to teach you about programming. It's assuming, as stated in the entry video, that you have some knowledge of programming, you have been building application, and this is just to take you and show you some best practices in the production level of building APIs. However, I'm trying to start as low as possible to get even those who are basically just work even just like AIs and be building projects to at least get some idea about it. So we are going to create a basic model, which is going to be our user model, right? So we're going to create a class which is called a user class, and you're also going to be seeing some annotations in the screen, and we're going to have one here which is going to be our entity. Now an entity represents a table in your database. So in MySQL table will be an entity, and we want to have so it's going to be, I think it's a table. I want to change the name of that to be users. Yes. Do we want to have something schema? No. So want to have like names to be users, because user is already I think a reserved word, so usually we always change it to users, right? And this is probably the only one that we always do this. So now this error here is saying that persistent entity user should have a primary key, and again this is all, you see, the primary key only applies to tables in the database, and this user does not have a primary key. We are using the Spring. This is from Jakarta. It's from the JPA, and this entity basically renders this entire class as a table. So we need to give it a primary key, which is going to be private. In this case, we're going to use integer, right? So private int ID, right? We can do that. And then what we want to do is want to give our users a username. We want to give them a name. So under private string, not first. Well, should we have like first name? Is it a lot? Let's go last name, and then username. We're going to have like the email, private string, email, and then we're going to have the password there. So these are all very important. These are all columns in this table of users, and should have a primary key. And so we have defined the integer, but we have not defined it as a primary key. So we want to define it as ID, and that's going to make it a primary key. And we also want to do increment. There is generated user, generated value. There we go. Again, it's been a while, so these things are a bit, so you can see me struggle here. I've not like learned this thing prior to this, so you can see me a bit struggle here. So identity, yes, is going to keep them in, so it's going to increment them, right? So let's see, do we have anything now? So ID, we're going to have identity like that, and then first name, password. Do we need anything here? We can manually do the constructor and stuff, but I don't want to do all of that. Okay. Again, this is not a programming class. We have to do like a constructor, getters and setters. Yes, so we can have like a constructor, yeah. Constructor. Yes, constructors for the different constructors, and they'll have like getters and setters. Yeah, it's going to take a lot of time, right? I think we can generate that. We can generate it. We can generate a constructor. can generate a constructor for, we will not need the ID. The ID will be, oh yeah, we will need the ID. Oh, the ID. So we have like, okay. Right, so we have like a constructor like that. We can also generate partial constructor, right? So there are different kind of constructors we can generate here. We also generate getters and setters here, right? Rather than writing it, right, something like that, we usually just generate it. It takes time to write it, and it's just boilerplate code that in Kotlin, these boilerplate codes are reduced heavily, and that's one of the beauty of Kotlin. So we can do getters and setters. Again, it's just a lot, just a lot. So we can do, well, the ID, you can use the getter to get the ID, but the ID is not probably going to have a setter, and then we also have like a toString method there. So it's so much code, and it's not really, makes it development a little bit slow and not neat. So we are going to use a dependency to remove that. So we are going to check for Lombok. Lombok modern plugin. But this one doesn't have like much use. So it's a bit suspicious. Like if you look at the other one, like 3,000 something usage. Lombok is a Java library that provides annotation to simplify Java development by automating generation of boilerplate code. Yeah. For project Lombok. Oh no. No, so simply annotating something else. So we can have the dependency again. So in the where we get the so we're going to open the resource for the resource folder. We're going to open the it's not the resource. We're going to open the POM file, and then we're going to put in our Lombok here. So so we're going to try to resolve the dependency. Hopefully that does not reject that, because sometimes this Marvin stuff gets really difficult. So why is resolving dependency? Of course, so we have that. Again, not a fan. Hate it. Could not transfer artifact that no such hosts. So really not a fan of this. I hate it. Again, we have to try to verify. I think it will be verify. Did I resolve it? I doubt. It does resolve it, okay. So we're going to turn off the application there. And now that we have Lombok, we can now use very interesting annotations such as all acts constructor. You can just have like a data class, right? So that's going to import from Lombok at data, and that's going to give you a lot of things like toStrings. We can also have like all acts constructor, and also have no apps constructor. no ask constructor. So we have like the no ask constructor first before the all ask constructor, and then we probably want to have these two. No, probably have these two. Okay, no, so it's just above, yeah, entity username. I'm going to have that too. So no ask constructor, all ask constructor, the data. I don't know if the data is going to get the toString. The data is going to get the getters and setters. I'm hoping that the toString is also there. If not, we can still add the toString there. So toString. Yes. So basically, rather than importing all of, you can import all of this, but you can also just import all of Lombok. So by including just star there, we'll go. But this saves us from doing the constructor getters and setters and then the string method, even the hash, because it's included in the data. And yeah, so you see it's very it's the entire code is very small now. Okay, we can also do, so in the database you can also do naming, such as the columns. These are columns, right? We can now change the name to, of course you've seen it, first name, right? Because usually database format is a snake case, so we use the first name, and the nullable should be false, obviously, right? Because these are methods and these are parameters which you're passing. These are rules that you're creating on these names. So when you're creating a data, when you're creating a table or columns in a table, you usually have options where you're doing it manually on like what are you calling this, workbench or examp or wamp, depending on the interface you're using. We're going to do similar thing here. We're going to use the add column, right? So this is the database section validation. We're going to the name, which is going to get the last name, right? And we're going to have the nullable false too. Okay. So annotations, they don't need ending semicolon. And username, so technically, do we need username? But let's just say we need username, right? So we're going to have columns, right? And so it's going to same thing. You don't need to specify here. You might just want to specify this, and also you specify that it's unique to make sure that you don't have two people with the same username. These are validations, and this is part of the design. And email is same thing. Email is going to be the same thing with the username. Usually you either use a username or an email, but sometimes it's also good. And the password is going to be name, password, and then nullable false. And that's all. That'll be all. Now, so so we have like a user. Is there anything else? ID, we have the primary key. You can also have like the date it was updated, private. So you can have like the date it was updated, but that's just going to have complications. We're not designing a full scale stuff here, because you have to update that date at transaction time. So, and make it, so anyway, this is okay. This is a simple one. And so we have a model, and just to make sure you understand how this works, when we create, because we have the database connected and we're using JPA, when we create the model, we don't have to create it directly on the table. We can just run the application, and we're going to see the SQL, the command line there, just because you remember this line. This allows us to see the SQL queries in the command line, how it's run. We're going to see outputs there. So that user is we're going to create a user table when we run this, and hopefully it's going to be successful, and we're able to see a user table with all the columns there. So let's try and run it and see what happens. So run that. So enable Lombok annotation. So remember to enable that, because he has to read it. So there we go. So this is what it shows us. but not sure. Not sure that it has created anything. So except I have not saved it, and that'll probably be the problem. But normally when you run it, it's supposed to automatically save. But let's try and refresh and see what happens. Alright, so we have a table which has been created, of course. It's just that I did not see the query here. Yeah, it's supposed to show create table. So you're supposed to have a query here. And so I don't know if this is reading correctly. So it's like show query true, but it's not reading. So I'm not sure that is reading correctly. Or maybe there's parameter I might put in. Either way, our user table is created, as you can see, with the ID, the email, the first name, the last name, the password, and the username. Okay. So now we can now work. We know that our database is connected properly as we did last time, and now our user is, we have a user table. Okay. So what happens now is we are going to create a controller, a basic API endpoint, and the first thing we're going to do, go to the controller. We're going to go to the controller package. We're going to right click on it to open a new class, and we're going to choose the class. We're going to have user controller. Okay, so we're just going to have that. So usually it's advisable to name, we're using the camel case, right? You know what camel case is. If you don't know, then it's something good for you to look up. And just to give you some assignments, you know, it's a simple case assignment. And so in order to create a controller in Spring Boot with Java, we're going to use something called a REST controller, which we're going to do add REST controller. Right. Normally you could also just use controller, but it's not going to be control. It's not going to be a REST endpoint, right? But in order to create a REST controller, you need to use the notation at REST controller. Okay. Now this is where all your endpoints are going to they are going to be found. All your endpoints, you get endpoints, and yeah. So I think there is another annotation I think I'm supposed to use here. It's been a while. I know I'm supposed to use some other annotations there, but it will come to me. But we can create. Let me see. Base controller. Do we have anything? String value. So I just Google that. Google create best controller Spring Boot. You can use a Spring documentation. They will tell you. So you have the entity there. Implement JPA repository application configuration. REST controller. There we go. So we have REST controller. Get mapping. Oh, okay. So there is. Oh, so it's just REST mapping. I feel like okay. I think what I'm remembering is So I think because you have a problem, you have to do like cross origin. Yeah, and then there's some other annotations that I usually put up here, which is you have cross origin there, and that's when you're trying to receive from different clients, and I think that's what was really tripping me off. So but REST controller is okay, but I also know that we can have a base URL here, which is going to be something like /user users, right? Yeah. So no, we can have no, it's going to be, so we talked about versioning API. So how do we structure our API? Okay, this is where design comes in. And when you use URLs, so the URL you use here, or the path you define here, is going to be applied to all the paths that are included here, and you're going to see what I'm talking about, and I'm going to explain for us, right? So what we want to do is API, and then we use version 1, right? Okay, and then we go users. So you see we have done path versioning, we have used our version, we've called the API endpoint, and we have used a noun users. Okay, now we can simply run for a get. We can now run our CRUD operations. We can create different mappings, which is at mapping. So at post mapping. Okay, we want to send a post request, but we want to send a post request to what users. Okay, so post mapping to users / register. So we can put users / what you can sign up, or whatever I want to put there, but this time I'm going to use register. So what happens is that this particular path is going to be appended to that. So what you're actually calling here is this. Okay, that's what you're actually calling here. And at the end of the day, you'll be calling API version 1 users / register. And that's why we always use it here. If you don't use it here, you have to manually specify it each time you create. And so when we use it here, we're assuming that every endpoint is going to be prepended with this particular string. And that's part of the path, right? So we are now going to define, of course, we're having cross origins there. We're going to leave it there. We are going to define our public user, definitely users. And again, what you're seeing is the AI in the IntelliJ. And what is going to happen, we're going to create a method, which is what we've created here. We're going to be returning a user, we're going to be returning a register, we're going to be calling the register method, and we're going to be using the request body. Remember in our previous lessons, we talked about different ways an API receives data, and part of it is a request body. And we talked about how it's mostly used in the put, the post, and the patch request. And we are in this particular request, we want to receive user in the form of user in the form of this user object. So the data we want to receive is user with the username and everything like that. So we want to use user in the form of this user object, and that's what we want to do. And what Spring is going to do is that when you send the information, where is it, controller, it's going to map that user, the information you're going to send is going to map it to this user object. And now we can now call another service, which is going to be our service area, and send it to it. Remember, very important during structuring, we talked about that in your controllers, they should be as lean as possible. No business logic should be conducted here. At least the overwhelming majority of business logic should be conducted in the business area, which is a service area. So we are going to call the service layer, which is going to be a user service, right? And usual, so we are just going to call the basic class for user service, and we are going to annotate it to make sure in Spring that this is first of all indexed by Spring and managed by Spring, and also tell it that this is a service class. We are going to annotate it with the @service annotation, and you see it's coming from the Spring framework and the stereotype service. And what is going to happen is that we want to now write all our business logic here. We can now create our public user, okay, register, which is going to take user. So we have a basic implementation there, so don't fret, it's nothing to be afraid of. It's just saying that the basic implementation, e.g. save to the user database, and it's going to return a user. So we're going to implement this. So what is going to happen is we are going to now call from this controller, we're going to call the user service in order to save this user. And this user service takes as parameter, as argument, a user object, which of course we already have here. So in order to call this user service, we need the user service object within the controller. And we are going to do something called dependency injection, which is one particular design principle in programming, where the dependencies of each class are injected at one time. And Spring does that very efficiently, and we're going to be using the constructor dependency, and which is where normally we could use in fact, best practices is going to use constructor dependency, but I'm going to try to use the field dependency. And in order to use the field dependency is that we need to call user service. We need to create an object of user service here. So we say user service, right? User service, okay. But as you can see, this user service here has a problem, okay, because we need to initialize it. I think if we try to use it here, it's going to work fine, but we need to initialize this user service. It's not initialized, and it's going to render an error. Okay, so if I try, I think I'm going to return this, right? So if I try to run this, I don't know if this should not work, but Spring updates every day, so we're just going to return a user. If I try to run this, I think I should have an error here, but see, well, there's no error, so that works. But I think if we send some calls, we'll have an error telling you that this is not initialized. And the idea is that you're supposed to do something like equals to new user service, something like that. But this creates a user service immediately, right? It creates a user service, and you need to do that every time. So every time it's called, it's going to create a user service and so on. However, the Spring idea talks about Spring is mostly about singleton pattern, which essentially only creates a single instance of an object that allows you to reuse it. And so we're going to do I think so this is supposed to be private. Yeah, there we are going to have now the error. Private user service. So we should be able to have the error. Oh, that's still going to run, maybe. Yeah, that still runs. But again, we are going to do something called dependency injection, which is going to do auto-wired, and this is going to auto-wire this bin. Now, if you remove the auto-wire, you notice something. Spring, the ID doesn't pick that up. And that's because the Spring it's not initialized, okay? And so you cannot use it here. If you actually try to send a value, if you actually try to send a request, what this is going to do is going to throw an error, okay, saying that this has not been initialized. So you need to put in a field dependency. Normally, like I said, you have to do equals to new user service, and field user service may be fine now, okay. So you have all of those problems just to make sure that it is not mutable. So in order to just do that in Spring provides you the auto wire for field dependency, and once you do the auto wire, you have it it changes color to make sure that it tells you that Spring is handling it now. Okay, so maybe I haven't explained this the best way, but there is more research online, you can look at it. And when you have that, what this is going to happen is that when you get a post request to the register endpoint, you are going to get the request body, which is going to map to a user, and you're going to pass it to the register. You're going to pass it to the user service, calling the register method, and you're going to return whatever value is returned there. And if you go to the user service, the value that is returned is a user. We are yet to implement this. Okay. So in the next video, so to make sure that these videos are not too long, I'm going to cut it here, and in the next video we are going to continue about implementing this, and we're going to talk about the repository area and some other sections. Okay, so if you have enjoyed this video thus far, please give it a thumbs up, comment your questions, your thoughts, your opinions about it, and maybe tips on how to better teach it, and maybe place where I make some errors, you could correct us in the comment below, and I'm going to highlight your comments, because of course I am learning just as much as you, and I will welcome your thoughts. So follow me on my socials and let's connect, let's talk computer and innovation. That said, to the next video, I'm Ngane.